Now, I grew up in a family where every single dollar counted. And when families like mine find out what was done, they are going to be furious. Our affordability problem in this state got a lot worse.
Welcome back to Searchlight Report, a podcast from South Dakota Searchlight. I'm Megan O'Brien, and our podcast brings you up to date on policy and politics in the Mount Rushmore state. Lawmakers upheld both of the governor's vetoes earlier this week, bringing the state's legislative session to an end. But first, you just heard from U.S. Representative Dusty Johnson, one of the 4 Republican candidates for South Dakota governor. Johnson is leading in publicly released polls so far, and he stayed on the offensive during the first debate of the race earlier this week. We're bringing you audio highlights courtesy of Kello TV. Johnson criticized Governor Larry Roden and Del Rapids Speaker of the House John Hanson for supporting multiple bills authorizing sales tax increases during their efforts to reduce property taxes.
John and Larry have told you that they lowered your taxes. That's not true. The reality is that they have raised your taxes. And in fact, Larry signed 3 sales tax increases just this legislative session.
Roden and Hanson both supported successful legislation that will use higher sales taxes to reduce homeowner property taxes. One new law allows the statewide sales tax rate to increase from 4.2% to 4.5% next year, as lawmakers scheduled it to do when they temporarily lowered the rate in 2022. The new law will capture an estimated $114 million in revenue from the increase and use it to reduce homeowner property taxes. Another new law gives counties their first ever option to impose up to a 0.5% sales tax, with proceeds required to be used for homeowner property tax credits. Roden signed both bills into law, and Hanson supported both bills after he tried to keep the state's sales tax rate at 4.2%.
When you couldn't get the tax down to 4.2% and it's going up to 4.5%, I led doing the next best thing, which is taking all of that revenue and putting it back into the people's pockets for property tax relief.
Roden also signed another bill that Hanson voted against. It lets cities impose an additional temporary sales tax to pay for special projects if approved by 60% of a city's voters. After Johnson criticized Roden for signing multiple sales tax increase bills, Roden responded. He pointed out that Johnson's own property tax relief plan, released before the legislative session, would have used revenue from the statewide sales tax increase to give property tax credits to homeowners.
Where I live, they would call that DCBS, because Representative Johnson, just a few weeks before we had laid out our proposal, I was at a press conference, and he laid out a proposal that used the exact same sales dollars for his property tax plan.
Also vying for the Republican nomination is Toby Doden from Aberdeen, who describes himself as a businessman outsider.
A lot of people say I'm just running to phase out and eliminate property taxes. Well, that is certainly part of my affordability plan.
He says the state's spending is out of control, but has not offered a specific plan to eliminate property taxes. The 4 Republican candidates also shared their thoughts on economic development policies. Hanson wants to limit tax incentives for big businesses and protect the free market.
And if you look back at the history of South Dakota, that has been the biggest driver of economic prosperity in South Dakota and, frankly, the world's history. It's called freedom in the free market.
Doden says small businesses have been left behind in the state. He has built and operated multiple businesses, including vehicle dealerships.
We're going to roll back regulation. We're going to find easier pathways to capital. If we want to fix South Dakota's lagging behind economy, we have to, for the first time in a generation, elect a businessman outsider.
CNBC recently ranked the state's business climate 35th in the nation. Johnson says South Dakota should do more to support small businesses.
Rather than chase around big corporate titans, let's make sure that the South Dakotans have an opportunity to create those great jobs here.
Roden says the state is performing well economically.
Every week I'm going to ribbon cuttings and groundbreakings, and a lot of them are expansions or businesses that are moving here.
Candidates also discussed former Governor Kristi Noem's leadership, Noem served as South Dakota's governor from 2019 to 2025 when she resigned to lead the National Department of Homeland Security. The Kello moderators asked each Republican candidate to assign a letter grade to her performance. Roden served as her lieutenant governor and succeeded her. He rated her time in office an A.
Because I had a front row seat at some very tough times. And it is really difficult for me to be here and remain calm because I've heard the attacks from after COVID from legislators that were hiding under rocks for 2 years while Christie was taking the slings and arrows for taking a stand and standing alone as the only governor of 50 governors that refused to close businesses in the state.
Doden rated her performance a B.
I did a 66 county, 100 plus stop bus tour. I'm in the middle of my second bus tour today. Everywhere I went, I met people, thousands of people I met in 2 years that had moved here from places like Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota. And what they would tell me, they moved here because Governor Noem and the people of South Dakota proved that there was hope, that we were the freest and the greatest state in the country. And I applaud her for that. I applaud our entire state for that.
Hansen graded her performance as a C.
Well, thanks. Well, there's a lot of history there. It goes all the way back to COVID when the Noem Roden administration brought a bill before the legislature to allow the Secretary of Health to shut the state down because of COVID. It was actually the legislature that killed that bill. I was part of it. We kept the state open. And for the years that we've been fighting to make our legislature more conservative, we put up conservative candidates. They've put up moderate to liberal Republican candidates. So if you want to look at who's really been fighting the fight for conservative Republican values, look no further than some of us in the legislature who have been leading the way on that. That includes me.
Johnson refused to grade Noem's performance as a governor. He told the Kello moderators,
Yeah, I'm not going to answer, Dan. You guys are better journalists than this. If we want to have a real conversation about the previous 8 years, let's have it.
But Johnson pointed at key moments through Noem's political career, including serving in the state's legislature, in Congress, and her recently concluded stint leading the federal Department of Homeland Security.
I saw her as the assistant House leader in the state legislature, and she worked real hard to keep a pretty fractious group of people together moving in the same direction. I saw her 8 years in the U.S. House where she elevated human trafficking from something that it was evil that was just swept into the corners, and she turned it into something that we understood, we talked about, and we combated. I saw her 6 years as governor where she did send a different message to this country about freedom and about COVID. I've seen her as Secretary of Homeland Security. It's pretty hard to boil all of that down to a letter grade.
There are also two Democratic candidates hoping for a spot on November's ballot. Dan Allers is a former state legislator and executive director of the state Democratic Party. Robert Arnold is a Dakota State University student who served as a legislative intern. The primary election is June 2nd. The winner in the four-way Republican primary will need at least 35% of the voters' support to earn the Republican nomination and appear on November's general election ballot. Failing that, the top two candidates will advance to a runoff 8 weeks after the primary. Early voting for the primary begins April 17th, and the voter registration deadline is May 18th. For more from the debate, check out Joshua Heyer's reporting at SouthDakotaSearchlight.com.
South Dakota journalism is changing. Traditional, corporate-owned media outlets have reduced their staffs. Newspapers have lost pages and publication days. That's why South Dakota Searchlight shares its work with other outlets for free. We hope local outlets republish our statewide news and commentary, and we hope that frees them up to focus on their community. That means you might see our work at SouthDakotaSearchlight.com, in your local paper, on the website of your local TV station, or even on the airwaves of your local radio station. All of that is possible with your support to our nonprofit mission. You can help at SouthDakotaSearchlight.com/donate.
The last day of the legislative session is set aside for lawmakers to consider the governor's vetoes. Earlier this year, South Dakota Republican Governor Larry Roden vetoed 2 pieces of legislation. A veto override needs at least 2/3 support, which is 47 votes in the House, where each vetoed bill started on veto day. The first bill would have classified cell-cultured proteins as an adulterated food, basically banning lab-grown meat in the state. Republican Representative Julie Auk from Lesterville sponsored the bill. She brought the legislation to protect the state's cattle industry.
This is not about coexistence. This is about replacement. Replacement of ranchers, replacement of farmers' family operations, replacement of rural economies, and the replacement of a food system rooted in the land with one controlled by patents, corporations, and laboratories.
Instead, Roden and other lawmakers backed a 5-year ban on the sale, production, and distribution of those products, which Roden signed into law earlier this year. He wants to allow more research on cell-cultured protein, but doesn't want to limit the free market. Votes on his veto tied at 32-32 in the House, sustaining Roden's veto and making Senate consideration unnecessary. 7 other states have bans on cell-cultured protein products. South Dakota already has a law adopted last year that requires the products to be clearly labeled as not conventionally produced. The state also cannot use state money for the research, production, promotion, sale, or distribution of lab-grown meat, with an exception for public universities. The other bill Roden vetoed would have required licenses for non-medical home care agencies and created penalties for violations. Brookings Republican Representative Melissa Heerman sponsored the legislation.
At the beginning of working on this bill, it had much stronger language. We had hoped to take a bigger step forward in this space, a space currently completely unregulated. It's a common step in protecting our most vulnerable. Abuse in this space is difficult to identify, investigate, and prosecute. And the easiest way to protect our vulnerable South Dakotans in their home is to not hand bad actors the key to their front door.
Roden told lawmakers in a veto letter that he thought the legislation was too broad and said the Department of Health lacks authority to examine or verify background checks. State representatives voted 36-27 in favor of overriding the veto, falling short of the 47 votes needed to send the bill to the Senate. Lawmakers also used veto day to advance a bill to Roden's desk, where it was signed into law. The state will invest an additional $8.2 million into repairing the dam and spillway at Richmond Lake, just north of Aberdeen. The deteriorating, nearly 90-year-old dam is state-owned and the state's responsibility to fix. That's according to Senator Mark Lapke, a Republican from Leola.
You know, the biggest thing that is at risk here is if a catastrophic failure would occur, there is, in fact, people's lives in danger. And it's one of those what ifs that you have to take seriously and address. And I think that's what we have the opportunity here today to do, is to leave it better than when we got it.
The replacement fund for the aging dam has already received more than $26 million, but state officials said they received less federal funding than they anticipated. Construction will begin immediately and finish in 2028. That's all we have for this week on Searchlight Report. The podcast is based on reporting by South Dakota Searchlight's staff, editor Seth Tupper, senior reporter John Holt, and reporters Joshua Heyer, Mackenzie Huber, and me. I write the scripts and produce the audio with editing by Seth Tupper. Audio this week came from recordings by South Dakota Searchlight, legislative live streams provided by South Dakota Public Broadcasting, and Keloland Media Group's Republican gubernatorial debate. South Dakota Searchlight is part of States Newsroom, the nation's largest nonprofit news organization. Until next time, I'm South Dakota Searchlight's Megan O'Brien with the Searchlight Report.